When this team came to me and said, Logan, the topic of today is the end of the world, I said, you know what? I don't know if that's necessarily where we're going to go here. And then they played me a clip from President Trump that happened over the weekend. It was really the discussion on the availability and the existence of an extreme amount of nuclear warheads and bombs and what that looks like on a worldwide global scale. And of course, they showed me a clip that specifically he says those things. And I said, you know what? We do need to talk about that. We need to bring in people that know a bit more about this topic, and that's precisely what we're going to do. Should we play President Trump here right off the bat? I think you should hear this to set this up so we can keep this conversation going. Here's President Trump from Fox Business. This was just yesterday.
I'd love to cut defense spending, but not now, because you have China, you have Russia, you have a lot of problems out there. No.
In fact,
no, what I have said is we spend a lot of money on nuclear missiles, nuclear weapons. The level of destruction is beyond anything you can even imagine. It's just bad that everybody has to spend all this money on something that if it's used, it's probably the end of the world.
It's probably the end of the world if it's used, but of course we feel like we have to have it, and because these other nations do as well. And later on, he even discusses how, in a perfect world, this would not exist, that these kind of weapons we wouldn't even have, no one would have, but we do live in a world where they do exist, and we know they've been used, and we've used them, and paid the consequences, I'd say, for a lot of that as well. But Professor Hutchison, you were breaking down in the meeting we had before this, just telling about where you think they are, who has them, where do they exist, because this is not something that's theoretical. This is something that is happening in real time, and we have to be very careful.
I think you're precisely correct. We live in a world of mutual assured destruction. As we speak, Russia has nuclear submarines stationed off the coast of Great Britain and of the United States. And Russia only has to detonate a weapon in the Atlantic Ocean or the English Channel to flood 50% of Great Britain. So this is an important threat, and it's much more important than so-called climate change or the end of democracy as represented by Adam Schiff. So one of the things that the American people should know is that Donald Trump is talking about something that is very, very important, number one, but number two, it is under-discussed in the United States. It's under-discussed in Western Europe. Will mentioned earlier that France, for instance, is sending nuclear-capable fighter jets to Germany so that they can be closer to Russia. Meanwhile, the president of France doesn't seem to understand that Moscow could send nuclear weapons to Paris in a matter of minutes. And so I think at the end of the day, this underscores the Trump administration's willingness to focus on solving the war in Ukraine. However you look at what's going on in Ukraine, I think everyone should acknowledge that at the end of the day, there is embedded in that conflict a nuclear threat that could destroy the entire universe.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at it from that point of view, I think for those of us that grew up, born in the 80s, we think of the nuke crisis and the issues that came in and all of the things we heard of from our parents and our grandparents, and it almost feels like something in the past. It almost feels like a historical, we're talking about the Civil War. It feels like it's something that's 100 years ago, 200 years. It doesn't have, for some reason, we've almost made it parody worthy. You think about like the Indiana Jones film, not this last one, the one before that, where he gets nuked and he's in a fridge and survives, and it's this silly moment right at the beginning of the movie, because we've almost cartoonified the war potentially with nukes. President Trump, as what seems to be, brings these things back to mind, and maybe we actually start having conversations that matter. And that's what I think you brought up too, is sure, I said this earlier, you could say whatever you want about the climate. We can, if you're someone who believes we have to be really protecting our planet and doing everything, that's fine. But what about what we're doing today? What about we're dealing with what's happening in the world right now? It's when you start comparing religious beliefs and faiths to the way they were held maybe hundreds of years ago. You heard about that with Islamic terror, that people will say, well, the Crusades. It's like, yeah, well, the Crusades aren't happening today. I actually am dealing with what's happening today. And I feel like it's similar.
When you think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest I think the world came to nuclear war, it was because these weapons were stationed in Cuba, 90 miles south of Florida.
Right here.
Very close to the United States. And it escalated. It fortunately did not end up in nuclear war. But when you hear President Trump talk about World War III, you're gambling with World War III, it's the same in reverse as the Cuban Missile Crisis, because what now we're seeing is the moving of nuclear weapons closer and closer to Russia, who's feeling threatened by this. Yes, their action to invade Ukraine was a trigger point, but you can't forget that, as France says, we're going to move fighter jets and station them in the eastern part of Germany so that they are closer to provide a nuclear umbrella. These are escalating maneuvers. And what President Trump is trying to do, Professor Hutchison, is de-escalate this, talk to each other. Much like was how the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, was through high stakes, very close to nuclear war diplomacy. But he's trying to avoid nuclear catastrophe around the world, and those that keep pushing for more and more resources to Ukraine, moving strategic weapons closer and closer to Russia, that puts us in a very precarious place of getting back to a Cuban Missile Crisis style crisis, but in 2025.
I think you're precisely correct. So if you look at the progression of NATO across Europe, it has moved closer and closer to the territory of Russia. And Russia has taken note of this. Meanwhile, NATO, for instance, has continuously promised that they would not move towards Russia. We promised in the 1990s that NATO would stop, perhaps around Hungary. But now we're talking about Ukraine, which is right on the border with Russia. So that's essentially like stationing, potentially, missiles in Cuba or in Montreal or Toronto. And if a hostile power were to do that to the United States would rightly react. So I'm not going to justify what Russia has done in Ukraine, but at least I think it's imperative to understand what motivates Russia. And what Donald Trump is trying to do is to diminish the possibility that the Ukrainian conflict erupts into a nuclear Armageddon.
We are so excited to announce the ACLJ's brand new app, completely redesigned to provide you with the best tools available to partner with us at the ACLJ. You can watch the daily Secular program, sign the petitions, customize your ACLJ membership experience, donate with the click of a button, and receive up-to-the-minute critical updates that the mainstream media can't censor. Just scan the QR code on your screen or go to your phone's app store, search ACLJ, and click install. It's that simple.